January 17, 1991. Al-Busayr, Iraqi desert. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when Senior Lieutenant Viktor Mikhailovich Volkov felt the first tremor beneath his boots. He stood beside a captured Iraqi T-72M tank, its Soviet-made hull still warm from the previous day's sun, his weathered hands tracing the familiar contours of reactive armor plates he had helped install on similar machines outside Chelyabinsk 7 years prior. The desert wind carried the scent of diesel and sand, and somewhere in the distance the low rumble of engines suggested movement, American movement. Volkov had trained Iraqi tank crews for 3 years, teaching them the doctrine perfected in the great tank battles of Kursk and the Dnieper, where Soviet steel had broken the Wehrmacht's spine. He believed, as did the engineers in Nizhny Tagil and the planners in Moscow, that the T-72 represented the pinnacle of armoured warfare, a machine born from the terrible lessons of the Eastern Front, refined through decades of Cold War competition, and now deployed across a desert that would prove or disprove everything the Soviet military-industrial complex had promised. The Americans were coming. Intelligence reports called them the 1st Cavalry Division and the 3rd Armoured Division, units equipped with something called the M1 Abrams. Volkov had read the technical specifications in classified briefings, studied the grainy photographs smuggled from NATO exercises. The Americans had built a 70-ton behemoth powered by a turbine engine. A turbine, like a jet aircraft, that consumed fuel at obscene rates and required maintenance crews the size of a small platoon. Soviet analysts had laughed at the intelligence reports. The Americans, they said, had built a race car when warfare demanded a workhorse. The T-72 weighed 41 tons, could cross bridges the Abrams would collapse, ran on diesel available in any village from Siberia to Syria, and cost 1/5 the price. Quantity had its own quality, Stalin had observed, and the Soviet Union had exported thousands of T-72s to allies across the globe. When the curtain finally fell and the great confrontation came, Soviet doctrine promised, the Americans would drown in a sea of steel. But standing in that pre-dawn darkness, Volkov felt something his training had not prepared him for: uncertainty. The Americans had sent 500,000 soldiers across an ocean, built supply depots larger than Soviet cities in the middle of the desert, and assembled an armada of equipment that intelligence suggested included technologies the Soviet Union was still testing in laboratories. And now they were coming, rolling north through the darkness with thermal sights that turned night into day, and targeting computers that calculated ballistic solutions faster than any human gunner. The history of armoured warfare had always been a story of doctrinal confidence shattered by technological reality. In 1940, French tankers had believed their Char B-1 bis tanks, with armour thicker than anything Germany possessed, would stop the Wehrmacht at the Meuse. They had not accounted for German tactical doctrine, for Stuka dive bombers and mechanised infantry, for commanders like Heinz Guderian, who understood that tanks were not mobile pillboxes, but instruments of manoeuvre. In 1941, Soviet tankers had believed their T-34s and KV-1s, superior in armour and firepower to any German tank, would halt Operation Barbarossa at the border. They had not accounted for German training, for radio communication in every panzer, for tactical flexibility born from years of combined arms experience. Superior machines meant nothing without superior doctrine, logistics, training, and coordination. And now, 50 years after the first great tank battles of World War II, the question would be answered again. Had the Soviets learned the right lessons from history, or had they, like the French and the early Red Army, built their doctrine on assumptions that would shatter under the pressure of combat? Viktor Volkov would not be present for the answer. Within 72 hours, he would evacuate to Baghdad, then to Moscow, carrying with him reports that Soviet military planners would read with disbelief and growing horror. But in that moment, in the pre-dawn darkness of January 17th, he believed, as his instructors had taught him to believe, as Soviet military doctrine demanded he believe that the T-72 was the finest tank in the world, and that the Americans were about to learn the same lesson the Germans had learned at Kursk, that Soviet armor was unbreakable. The first lesson of the Gulf War was learned before any shots were fired. The Americans did not fight the way Soviet doctrine predicted they would fight. For 40 years, Soviet war planning had assumed the next great conflict would replicate the Eastern Front. Massive formations meeting in head-on collisions, waves of armor grinding against defensive positions, battles of attrition won by the side that could replace losses faster. The Soviets had built their military to win that war. Every T-72 factory, every artillery piece, every mobilization plan assumed the enemy would accept direct confrontation. NATO would defend the Fulda Gap. The Red Army would break through with overwhelming numbers. It was mathematical, predictable, comfortingly familiar. But General Norman Schwarzkopf and his coalition commanders had studied those same Eastern Front battles and drawn different conclusions. They had studied Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae, Sherman's march through Georgia, Patton's sweep across France. They understood that the worst place to meet the enemy was where the enemy expected you, that mobility and deception could achieve what frontal assaults could not. And so the coalition did not attack the Iraqi defensive positions head-on. Instead, they launched the largest flanking maneuver since World War II, a left hook that swung 2 entire corps west through the empty desert, bypassing Iraqi fortifications entirely, cutting off retreat routes, and striking from directions Iraqi planners had deemed impossible. The Iraqi army, trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with Soviet weapons, had prepared for the wrong war. They had built defensive positions modelled on Soviet doctrine, minefields, berms, kill zones designed to channel attackers into prepared firing positions. They had dug in their T-72s as static gun platforms, creating strongpoints that could decimate any force foolish enough to attack directly. Soviet observers approved. This was proper doctrine, the lessons of Kursk and Berlin applied to desert warfare. The Americans, they calculated, would lose thousands of tanks trying to break through. Instead, the Americans went around. And when they met Iraqi armor in the open desert, in the running gun battles that Soviet tankers had trained for, had dreamed of, had built entire careers preparing for, the T-72s discovered that every assumption they had been given was catastrophically wrong. The first illusion to shatter was the belief that Soviet armor could withstand American firepower. The M1 Abrams mounted a 120mm smoothbore gun manufactured by Rheinmetall of Germany, firing depleted uranium penetrators designed by American weapons laboratories in Los Alamos and Sandia. These were not the tungsten rounds of World War II, not even the improved penetrators of 1970s technology. Depleted uranium was denser than lead, harder than hardened steel, and when formed into a long rod penetrator traveling at 1700 meters per second, it did not so much penetrate armor as vaporize it. The physics were brutal and simple. The kinetic energy at impact was sufficient to turn both the penetrator and the target armor into plasma, creating a jet of superheated metal that punched through reactive armor, through the main hull, through anything in its path, and out the other side. Soviet reactive armor, the Contact 1 system mounted on upgraded T-72s, had been designed to defeat shaped charge warheads by detonating outward when struck, disrupting the formation of the penetrating jet. It worked brilliantly against rocket-propelled grenades and older anti-tank missiles. It did nothing against depleted uranium penetrators. The long rods simply punched through the reactive bricks without triggering them, or triggered them and continued through anyway, the explosive force of the reactive armor insufficient to deflect a penetrator carrying the kinetic energy of a freight train, compressed into a rod the diameter of a broom handle. Iraqi tank crews discovered this in the most final way possible. T-72 tanks, taking frontal hits from Abrams guns at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, simply exploded. their turrets blown off by the catastrophic detonation of ammunition stored in a carousel beneath the turret ring, a design feature that Soviet engineers had accepted as a necessary compromise for a low-profile tank. When an Abrams penetrator punched through the hull and struck the ammunition carousel, the result was instantaneous. 40 rounds of 125mm ammunition detonating simultaneously, generating pressures that could not escape fast enough through the hatches, pressures that lifted the 40-ton turret off its mounting ring and threw it 10 meters into the air. American pilots called them jack-in-the-boxes. Iraqi survivors, when there were survivors, called them death traps. The second illusion to shatter was the belief that Soviet targeting systems were adequate for modern warfare. The T-72's fire control system was mechanical, analog, dependent on a gunner's ability to estimate range, calculate lead for moving targets, and adjust for wind and temperature. It was essentially an improved version of the systems used in World War II, refined through decades of incremental improvement, but fundamentally unchanged in concept. Soviet doctrine considered this adequate because Soviet doctrine assumed tanks would fight at ranges under 1 kilometer, where mechanical targeting was sufficient, and where superior numbers would compensate for lower hit rates. The M1 Abrams carried a fire control system developed by Hughes Aircraft Corporation, a digital computer that integrated data from a laser rangefinder, crosswind sensor, thermal imaging sight, and ballistic calculator. The system calculated firing solutions automatically, corrected for the tank's own movement and the target's movement, adjusted for ammunition type and barrel wear. An American gunner could engage targets at 3 kilometers while moving at 40 kilometers per hour across broken terrain and expect first-round hits. The entire process, from target identification to shot, took seconds. Iraqi tankers discovered this disparity in the opening hours of the ground war. T-72 crews would spot American tanks at long range. The Abrams was not subtle, not hidden. The Americans did not hide, and would attempt to engage. Their shells would fall short, kick up dirt, or strike the frontal armor of the Abrams and bounce off, leaving scars but no penetration. The American tanks would not stop, would not take evasive action. They would continue advancing, and then, at ranges that Iraqi crews believed were impossible, the Abrams would fire. One shot, one kill. The Iraqi tank would explode or burn, and the Abrams would shift to the next target without slowing. This was not tank warfare as Soviet doctrine understood it. This was execution. Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Kokorev, attached to Iraqi Republican Guard as a technical advisor, watched the Battle of 73 Easting unfold from a command post 30 kilometers behind the front lines. He had access to radio communications, to Iraqi tank platoons engaging American forces near the Kuwait-Iraq border. What he heard contradicted everything his training had taught him. Iraqi tank commanders reported engaging American tanks at maximum range, 2,000 meters, 2,500 meters, and scoring hits that did nothing. "We hit them!" one commander screamed over the radio. "We hit them directly, and they're still coming." Then silence. Static. Kokorev switched frequencies, found another Iraqi unit, listened to similar reports. Panic, confusion, annihilation. Later, after the ceasefire, Kokorev would inspect knocked-out T-72s on the battlefield. He would find Iraqi tanks struck from ranges exceeding 3 kilometers, penetrated clean through the frontal armor, the crew compartment a charred cavity. He would find tanks hit from the side while moving, from the rear while retreating, hit with such precision that it was clear the Americans had not been firing blind or spraying fire in hopes of hitting something. They had been selecting targets, calculating solutions, executing with mechanical precision. He would measure the entry holes of American penetrators and find them perfectly circular, indicating perpendicular hits even at extreme angles. Evidence of computers correcting for barrel droop, for target movement, for variables that Soviet gunners calculated by instinct and experience. And he would find something else, something that Soviet intelligence had reported, but that Kokorev had not fully believed until he saw it with his own eyes. T-72 shells embedded in the armor of disabled Abrams tanks, shells that had struck and failed to penetrate. Deep gouges, cracks in the composite armor, but no penetration. The Americans had built armor that Soviet guns could not defeat. The composite armor of the M1 Abrams was classified, then and now, but its basic principle was understood. Layers of different materials, ceramics, depleted uranium, steel, composite matrices, arranged to disrupt and defeat kinetic penetrators. Unlike homogeneous steel armor, which could be calculated and defeated with sufficient velocity and penetrator design, composite armor forced the penetrator to pass through materials of wildly different densities and properties. Ceramic layers shattered penetrators. Depleted uranium layers absorbed kinetic energy. Spacing between layers allowed the penetrator to tumble and lose coherence. The exact composition was unknown to Soviet intelligence, but the result was clear. The frontal armor of the M1 Abrams was effectively immune to the 3BM-15 and 3BM-42 armor-piercing rounds fired by the T-72's 125mm gun. Soviet tankers had expected American armor to be heavy but vulnerable, a trade-off of mobility for protection. They had assumed that the 125mm gun, the most powerful tank gun in the Soviet arsenal, would penetrate any armor at standard combat ranges. This assumption was based on decades of testing against NATO armor models, against intelligence estimates of American composite armor thickness, against the reassuring calculations of Soviet ballistic engineers who promised that Soviet penetrators were adequate for any foreseeable threat. But intelligence estimates were not reality, and laboratory tests were not battlefield conditions. The Americans had not merely built thick armor, they had built smart armor, armor that defeated penetration through material science rather than simple thickness. And they had protected their armor composition so zealously that even after the Gulf War, even after Soviet observers inspected destroyed Abrams tanks, the exact specifications remained classified. What Soviet analysts could confirm was the result. At combat ranges, the T-72 could not penetrate the frontal armor of the M1 Abrams. The Americans could fire with impunity, knowing that return fire would fail. This was the nightmare scenario Soviet doctrine had never prepared for, that quality could not merely supplement quantity, but render quantity irrelevant. The third illusion to shatter was the belief that night belonged equally to both sides. Soviet tanks were equipped with passive night vision systems and infrared searchlights, technology developed in the 1960s and incrementally improved, but fundamentally unchanged. These systems amplified available light or illuminated targets with infrared beams invisible to the naked eye, but visible to infrared-sensitive optics. They worked adequately in European forests, where ambient light from stars and moon provided illumination, where engagement ranges were short, and tactical doctrine assumed night combat would be confused melees at close range. They did not work in the desert. There were no forests to provide ambient light, no overcast skies to reflect ground illumination. The desert night was absolute, and infrared searchlights, which required the tank to illuminate its target, gave away the tank's position to any enemy equipped with infrared detection. Iraqi tankers using their infrared searchlights were essentially spotlighting themselves for American gunners. The M1 Abrams was equipped with second-generation thermal imaging sights manufactured by Texas Instruments, devices that detected heat signatures rather than light. These systems did not require illumination, did not give away the tank's position, and were not degraded by darkness, smoke, or dust. An American gunner could see the heat signature of an Iraqi tank's engine at 3 kilometers, could distinguish between a tank and a truck by the pattern of heat radiating from the vehicle, could engage targets in complete darkness with the same accuracy as daylight engagement. The effect on the battlefield was apocalyptic. Iraqi tank units moving at night, believing themselves concealed by darkness, were engaged and destroyed by American forces they never saw. T-72 crews would see nothing, hear nothing, and then their tank would explode, struck by a round fired from a position they could not detect with their available optics. Some Iraqi units attempted to fight back, sweeping their infrared searchlights across the desert in hopes of spotting American tanks. The searchlights did nothing except mark their own positions for American thermal sights. It was not combat, it was slaughter. Colonel Douglas McGregor, commanding officer of an American armored cavalry regiment, would later describe the Battle of 73 Easting as not a battle, but an execution. His unit destroyed an entire Iraqi armored brigade in less than 3 hours, killing or capturing over 1,000 soldiers and destroying more than 80 armored vehicles. American casualties: 1 Bradley fighting vehicle damaged, 0 killed. The engagement occurred at night, in a sandstorm, at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Iraqi forces never effectively returned fire because they never saw their attackers. They died in their vehicles, killed by an enemy that could see them but remained invisible. Soviet observers reading after-action reports in Moscow struggled to reconcile these accounts with their understanding of armored warfare. How could an entire brigade be annihilated without inflicting casualties? How could tanks be destroyed at ranges where they could not even see the enemy? The reports sounded less like military engagements and more like science fiction, like descriptions of alien technology wielded by forces against whom resistance was futile. But the reports were accurate. The Americans had not merely achieved technological superiority, they had achieved technological dominance so complete that the engagement was fundamentally asymmetrical. Soviet doctrine had no answer for an enemy that could see in the dark, hit at 3 kilometers, and ignore return fire. The doctrine was predicated on assumptions that both sides had roughly equivalent technology, that engagements occurred at similar ranges, that numerical superiority could compensate for tactical disadvantage, that no longer held. And beneath all the technical explanations, beneath the discussions of depleted uranium and thermal imaging and composite armor, there was a more uncomfortable truth that Soviet military planners struggled to articulate. The Americans had not merely built better tanks, they had built a better system, a better military, a better integration of technology and doctrine and logistics and training. The M1 Abrams was not just a machine, it was the product of a society that could afford to spend $3 million per tank, that could train crews for months on simulators before they ever entered a real vehicle, that could supply those tanks with fuel and ammunition across thousands of kilometers of desert, that could coordinate their movements with satellite communications and airborne radar and digital command networks. The tank was merely the tip of an enormous logistical and technological pyramid, and the Soviets were realizing, too late to matter but early enough to sting, that they had lost not just the tank battle, but the larger competition of systems. In February 1991, as the ground war ended and Iraqi forces surrendered or fled, coalition forces began cataloguing the wreckage. American units advancing north into Iraq encountered fields of destroyed tanks, avenues of burning vehicles, highways lined with wrecks. The scale of destruction was staggering. Over 4,000 Iraqi tanks destroyed or captured, including approximately 1,000 T-72s. Coalition tank losses, fewer than 50, mostly from non-combat causes, mechanical breakdowns, friendly fire, mines. Soviet military analysts studying the casualty ratios struggled to find historical precedents. Even the most lopsided tank battles of World War II, the German destruction of Soviet mechanized corps in 1941, the American annihilation of German panzers in Normandy, had not produced kill ratios this extreme. At Brody in 1941, German forces outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Soviet tanks had nonetheless inflicted 7-to-1 casualty ratios through superior tactics and crew training. At Aracord in 1944, American tank destroyers and Shermans had achieved 5-to-1 kill ratios against German Panthers and Tigers through tactical ambush and superior coordination. But 50-to-1? 80-to-1? These were ratios from pre-industrial warfare, from battles between muskets and machine guns, not between two supposedly peer militaries equipped with similar technology. The implications were devastating. The Soviet Union had exported the T-72 to allies across the world, from Syria to India to Angola, as a symbol of Soviet technological prowess and military capability. Soviet military advisors had trained those allies in Soviet doctrine, had assured them that Soviet weapons were equal or superior to Western equivalents, had built entire defense relationships on the promise that Soviet equipment would perform in combat. The Gulf War destroyed that promise. Within months, nations that had relied on Soviet equipment were cancelling orders, demanding upgrades, questioning whether their militaries could survive a confrontation with Western forces. The T-72, once a symbol of Soviet strength, became a symbol of Soviet inadequacy. In Moscow, military planners convened emergency meetings to analyze the Gulf War results and determine what had gone wrong. The initial reaction was denial. Iraqi crews were poorly trained, Iraqi maintenance was inadequate, Iraqi tactics were incompetent. If Soviet crews had manned those T-72s, if Soviet officers had planned the defense, the results would have been different. But as more data emerged, as Soviet advisors like Viktor Volkov and Anatoly Kokorev filed detailed reports, as intelligence analysts obtained battle footage and wreckage samples, the denial gave way to grim realization. The problem was not just Iraqi incompetence. The problem was that the T-72, and by extension Soviet armored doctrine, was obsolete. The Soviet military had built its doctrine on the lessons of the Great Patriotic War, on the victories of Stalingrad and Kursk and Berlin. Those lessons emphasized mass production, mechanical simplicity, numerical superiority. Soviet tanks were designed to be built by the thousands, maintained by conscripts with minimal training, operated by crews with basic skills. This approach had worked in 1943 because German industry could not compete with Soviet production, because German logistics were strained across a 1,000-mile front, because the Red Army could afford to lose tanks and replace them faster than Germany could destroy them. But the Cold War had not ended in 1945. While the Soviets continued building tanks optimized for mass production, the Americans and their NATO allies had shifted to a different paradigm. They accepted that they could not match Soviet production, that they would always be outnumbered, and therefore their tanks needed to be qualitatively superior. Each American tank needed to kill multiple Soviet tanks before being destroyed. And so they invested in technologies, composite armor, thermal sights, digital fire control, turbine engines, that were expensive, complex, and difficult to mass produce, but that provided decisive tactical advantages. The Gulf War demonstrated that this Western approach was not merely theoretically superior, but practically decisive. The Americans did not need numerical superiority, because their technological superiority was so extreme that numbers became irrelevant. A single M1 Abrams could destroy multiple T-72s before the T-72s could effectively return fire. An American tank battalion could annihilate an Iraqi tank brigade without suffering significant losses. Quantity did not have quality of its own. Quality had made quantity obsolete. For the Soviet military establishment, this realization was existential. The Soviet Union was collapsing, its economy in free fall, its political system disintegrating. It could not afford to replace its thousands of T-72s with more expensive designs. It could not afford to train crews to Western standards or equip its military with Western-level technology. And even if it could afford these things, the Gulf War suggested that the technological gap was so large that catching up would take decades. The Americans had not just won a single battle. They had demonstrated that the entire Soviet approach to armored warfare was fundamentally flawed. And so the laughter stopped. The Soviet tankers, who had mocked the M1 Abrams as an overcomplicated, overpriced symbol of American excess, now studied the Gulf War footage in silence. They watched Iraqi T-72s, tanks identical to the ones they commanded, explode under American fire. They read reports of Soviet armor-piercing rounds bouncing off American composite armor. They listened to Soviet advisors describe engagements where Iraqi forces were annihilated without seeing their attackers. And they understood, with the bitter clarity of hindsight, that everything they had been taught, every doctrine, every tactical principle, every confident assertion of Soviet superiority, was wrong. In the years following the Gulf War, the Russian military would attempt to learn these lessons, to develop new tanks and new doctrines that incorporated Western technological advances. The T-90, the T-14 Armata, these were attempts to close the gap, to build tanks that could compete with Western designs. But the gap remained, and the lesson remained. Technology alone was not enough. The Americans had built not just superior tanks, but a superior military system, and that system was the product of a society that invested in its military, trained its soldiers, maintained its equipment, and coordinated its operations with a level of professionalism and resources that the Soviet system, corrupt, inefficient, collapsing, could not match. There is a photograph taken in March 1991 that captures the aftermath of the Gulf War more eloquently than any written report. It shows a road north of Kuwait City, a highway lined with destroyed vehicles as far as the eye can see. Tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers, civilian cars, all burned, all abandoned, all testament to an army that disintegrated under the weight of American firepower. Coalition pilots called it the Highway of Death. Iraqi survivors called it the Road to Hell. Somewhere in that photograph, buried under sand and ash, are the remains of T-72 tanks that Soviet engineers had promised were unbeatable, that Soviet tankers had believed would stop any Western advance, that Soviet doctrine had insisted were sufficient for victory. The shells that bounced off American armor, the tanks that exploded under American fire, the crews that died without seeing their killers. These are not abstractions, not statistics in a report. They are the physical evidence of a doctrinal failure so complete that it shattered not just tanks, but illusions. The M1 Abrams, rumbling through the desert with its turbine engine howling and its thermal sights glowing, was not just a tank. It was a symbol of American technological dominance, of Western military superiority, of the end of Soviet pretensions to global power. Soviet tankers had laughed at it, mocked its complexity and expense, assured themselves that Soviet simplicity and mass production would triumph in the end. But when the shells bounced off its armor, when Iraqi T-72s exploded under its fire, when entire brigades disappeared in the night without landing a single effective blow, the laughter died. Because the lesson of the Gulf War, the lesson that Soviet tankers learned too late and at terrible cost, was not about tanks. It was about systems. It was about what a society that values innovation and invests in its military can achieve against a society that clings to outdated doctrines and ignores technological progress. It was about the difference between building weapons for parades and building weapons for war. It was about the consequences of believing your own propaganda, of assuming that quantity can substitute for quality, of preparing to fight the last war instead of the next one. The T-72 was a good tank by the standards of 1973 when it entered service. It was rugged, reliable, easy to produce. But the world had moved on, and the Soviet Union had not moved with it. While American engineers developed composite armor and thermal imaging, Soviet engineers refined existing designs. While American doctrine emphasized crew training and technological integration, Soviet doctrine emphasized mass production and numerical superiority. While American logistics demonstrated the ability to supply 500,000 soldiers across an ocean, Soviet logistics struggled to feed its own soldiers in Afghanistan. And so, when the test came, when Soviet doctrine and Soviet equipment met American doctrine and American equipment on the open battlefield, the result was not a battle, but a demonstration that the Cold War was over, that the Soviet system had lost, that all the parades and all the propaganda and all the confident assertions of Soviet superiority had been built on foundations of sand. In the end, the shells bouncing off American armor were not just physical objects deflecting off composite materials. They were the death throes of an ideology, the final proof that the Soviet model of military planning, of industrial production, of societal organization could not compete with the West. The Americans had not merely built a better tank, they had built a better system. And that system, tested in the crucible of desert warfare, had proven itself decisively superior. The Soviet tankers stopped laughing. And in the silence that followed, in the realization of what they had witnessed and what it meant, they understood that they had not lost a battle. They had lost a war that had been decided long before the first shot was fired, decided in research laboratories and tank factories, in training grounds and logistics centers, in the fundamental choices societies make about how to organize their resources and their values. The Americans had chosen innovation over tradition, quality over quantity, technological investment over ideological confidence. And in the desert of Iraq, under skies filled with American aircraft and across sands churned by American tanks, that choice had been vindicated. The M1 Abrams would continue serving for decades, upgraded and modernized, a testament to the enduring value of investing in quality. The T-72 would continue serving as well, in armies across the world that could not afford better, a reminder that quantity without quality is not strength but vulnerability. And somewhere in the archives of the Russian military, in reports stamped classified and filed away, the lesson remains: that laughter dies quickly when reality arrives, and that the shells bouncing off American armor were not anomalies, but prophecies. Prophecies of a future where Soviet dreams of military superiority were revealed as illusions, where confidence built on outdated doctrines shattered against the hard reality of technological progress, where the choice between investing in people and systems or clinging to comfortable myths was answered with fire and steel and the unmistakable sound of tank rounds ricocheting into the desert night.